Okay, hello and welcome, and thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Amanda, and I will be your host today. Please feel free to contact me with any technical assistance you need by typing into the chat box, and you can send those messages to all panelists. And you can also send any support questions to support@kit.org. So just to go through explaining some of the housekeeping rules for the platform we're using today. We do have our chat box, which is intended for us to share comments, ideas, and resources about the content, as well as to answer the instructor's prompts. But if you are going to contribute to the chat box, we ask that you dedicate your messages to all panelists and attendees so that everyone can see each other's responses. But we also have another feature called the Q&A box. And in that, you can enter your content-specific questions, which we will be able to answer for you at the end of our webinar during our Q&A session. And today's webinar is part of our Infant Toddler series, and it is on behavior and emotions in the toddler years. And your presenter today is Philip Collazo. Philip has 9 years of experience working with military child and youth programs worldwide, and he has over 19 years of experience as a special educator and behavior specialist. And overall, Philip strives to incorporate multisensory approaches to learning, including the arts, yoga, and brain science. And with that, I am pleased to turn it over to Philip.
Thank you so much, Amanda, and I thank everybody who's with us moving through these challenges. I don't think there's anyone in the world who maybe a couple of months ago wouldn't have talked about Zoom difficulties, and now today it's like water cooler chat. So thanks for sticking in there with us. Today, we are speaking on a topic that is near and dear to my heart. We're talking about infants and behavior. And funny, 80% of all of our calls that we get from providers in military and non-military programs is regarding children's behavior. So today we are going to address one major learning objective, or the concrete thing that we are going to accomplish during this next half hour. Today we are going to match the best practice strategy to the skill category in order to support social, emotional, and behavioral growth in babies. Disclaimer, I'm going to use the word educators to refer to all of the adults who may be working with children at military child and youth programs. And I'm also going to use the word babies to refer to this grouping of infants, pre-toddlers, and toddler-age children. Holiday cookies. Wait, I thought this was a training on behavior. Well, you're not mistaken. This is a training about infant and toddler behavior. However, I'd like to start by talking about my family's holiday cookies. So after we left our childhood home in New York, we settled into our adult lives in Florida. My sister and I found this piece of paper listing the ingredients, the measurements, and the temperature instructions for these holiday cookies that we loved as kids. Now, this was hardly a recipe, but it was something. So naively, we threw all the ingredients in a bowl, we mixed it up and baked. Voila, it was a failure. Thus started my family's yearly trials and tribulations with what have been now duped the cookies. Each year, we would try something new. We would add those steps onto a piece of paper with all the ingredients. No joke. On the slide, you see the picture of this paper where we just keep adding notes and scratching them out after each year's baking attempts. Now, for all those bakers out there, you know that there are 3 overall parts to the process. 1, you have to select the right ingredients and the amounts. 2, you have to combine them in the right order. 3, you have to bake them at the correct temperature and time. So we had the instructions for parts 1 and part 3, but it's in the combination, the mixing, step 2, that creates this magic, this flaky cookie that holds up to the jelly and doesn't crumble when you eat it. here's where we're going to jump back into infant and toddler behavior. Most educators know what infants and toddlers should learn based on those prescribed protocols in your curriculum. And we also know the when and where we're supposed to teach those skills. That's based on your prescribed daily routine and schedule. What we need help with is how do we mix the right combination of teaching strategies together and in the right order. Famous TV chef Julia Child once said, "No one is born a great cook, one learns by doing." I think the same can be said for being a great educator. We, the big people, learn as much through this trial and error process as our young students do. So how individuals acquire information and then use it to do something is a process that is as unique as our fingerprints. As we transition topics from baking to early childhood, let's think of the recipe as our early childhood curriculum. Just as cooks use and interpret and change recipes, I'd like us to think about how educators use, change, and plan activities through our curriculum. Let's call this our educator recipe philosophy. So think about how you integrate information and then facilitate your activities. What kind of educator recipe do you follow in general? Would you say that I facilitate activities as they're outlined in the curriculum? Or B, I get ideas from the curriculum and then I like to customize my activities? C, I create my own activities because I really like experimenting? Or D, I'm still learning and I look for guidance from those more experienced educators? On the next slide, you will have the opportunity to answer the poll in a new window. Just keep in mind, there are no right answers, nor is there any judgment about your individual process. I just want to get a sense of how this group gathers information and uses it to implement activities in the classrooms. So your educator recipe is a representation of how you might synthesize and use the information outlined in this webinar. So here it is. Let's take that poll. So if you could, in this new window that just popped up, take a second and choose your educator recipe philosophy. Okay, so I'm seeing a couple of people say that they like to gather their ideas so far. So a couple of people have chosen B. I see one person has selected, they like just experimenting and creating. So we'll give it a couple more seconds to let anybody else participate. Okay. Oh, where'd that poll go? Sorry. Let's end the polling. So, yep, okay. So there were a couple of people who entered their answers into the chat box, but it looks like most of us are getting the ideas and then customizing or just going out on our own and experimenting. Nice. So here are the results. All right, let's go on to the next slide. Since we are talking about how we learn, I'd like to incorporate one very particular viewpoint that is based on the science of learning. We are going to use a neuropedagogical lens. Now, I just like how it feels when you say neuropedagogical, but seriously, let's not try to get caught up on the big words. Many of you probably already know these concepts and principles. You may just call them by a different name. Neuropedagogy is the study of how children's brains learn and develop. It's the science of learning about learning. More specifically, mind, brain, and education science studies the relationship between learning, function, and emotion. Now, let's be clear. Researchers have been studying this stuff and all aspects of early childhood learning since the 1960s. These concepts in and of themselves are not new, but looking at how the human brain synthesizes, combines, or uses all of these components is new. So let's focus our neuropedagogical lens specifically onto early childhood learning. And more specific, let's hone down onto how it relates to babies. Remember, those are our infants, pre-toddlers, and toddler-age children. Here's where we are going to consider the mind-brain or mind-brain education, or MBE, science's view. For them, the intersections between language, movement, and social, emotional, behavioral skills are the key. That's their recipe, so to speak. These three components are interrelated, and it's in the combination of those three things where the magic happens. Now, if our teaching strategy is missing one or two of them, the recipe can't work. So I see that we had a hand raised. So if there's a question, by all means, enter it into the chat box, and I'll do my best to get back to you as soon as it comes up. So coming back to our topic, most babies' brains are focused on these three areas, almost to the exclusion of all the other areas of learning for their first 2 years of growth. We are going to adopt these three ingredients into our teaching recipe. So, in babies, the learning category focuses on language, specifically verbal and nonverbal language skills. Now, these skills will appear throughout our presentation in the color orange. The function category, or movement domain, will incorporate things like gross and fine motor skills. Remember, gross motor, the movement we do with our bodies; fine motor, the movement we focus on with our hands. These skills will appear in a bluish-green color throughout the presentation. Finally, the emotion category will incorporate things like social, emotional, and behavioral skills. Now, I didn't classify this specifically on the slide, but we're talking about a child's ability to interact with peers, to meet expectations, again, developmentally appropriate expectations, all of those behavioral and social skills that children under the age of 2 should use. Throughout this presentation, we are going to examine how these three ingredients mix together to form what we know as best practices for behavioral support in young children. If you're interested in exploring these skill categories a little bit more, a list of related webinars and resources will be provided at the end of this presentation. Thomas Edison said, "The chief function of the human body is simply to carry around the brain." Now, most of us already know that the brain is the boss of the body, but we've only scratched the surface of understanding how it does all those amazing things. So let's review what brain science tells us about skill development. Let's consider learning and language skills first. Did you know that babies who communicate with gestures or signs tend to develop memory skills faster and have stronger self-regulation skills? So here's a clear example where the language domain is strengthened by a social, emotional, behavioral skill. Next, let's look at function and movement. Babies who were walking tended to have more expansive verbal communication skills. Perfect example of movement strengthening a language skill. Now, here's a quick side note. So much of the research that I did to create this presentation honed in on this intimate relationship between language acquisition and what we call ambulation or physical movement. Now, these are usually gross motor movements, right? In babies, they're not working as much on fine motor. So there's this really big relationship between the onset of ambulation or gross motor movements and language acquisition. It's a really important relationship there. Now, finally, let's consider social emotional behavioral skills. Did you know that when babies' emotional needs are being met, they are way more likely to engage in movement and exploration activities? So here we see a social emotional skill actually encourages movement. Quick note, it's extremely difficult to pinpoint one specific area of the human brain that does one thing all by itself. So these boxes and the arrows point to the general functioning area in the brain that is related to each skill. But keep in mind, this is a very, very simplified model. Scientific breakthroughs are giving us a really great idea about what's going on. Earlier, I mentioned that our teaching recipe can't work when we leave out one or two of these skill sets. Well, the opposite is also true. When we incorporate all three components, one skill strengthens the others simultaneously. Think about that for a second. When we, the educators, we combine all of these skill sets into our strategies, magic happens. So let's focus our learning right now onto a specific behavioral skill. I'm going to call that complying with or following directions. According to one study, 14-month-old toddlers were 50% more likely to cooperate with instructions when the adult sang and encouraged children to move to a beat. It's really important to note that the adults in the study actively sang, moved, and modeled along with the children. And therefore, playing recorded music like the cleanup song on a radio may not have the same effect. Let's analyze how an interaction between an adult and a child can incorporate all three of these skill categories. Let's look at this example again. Toddlers are more likely to cooperate. There's the brown color, so that is a social, emotional, behavioral skill. So they're more likely to cooperate with instructions when the adult sang. There's our orange language skill, and encourage children to move to a beat. There's our movement skill, function category. We can see how one behavioral skill is strengthened by language and movement at the same time. Think about this. Have you and your coworkers ever sung the cleanup song to facilitate a transition? Take a minute, reflect. Did you walk over next to the children? Was it possible at that moment? Did you sing the words while you modeled cleaning up? Did you encourage the children to stomp, move, or clap to a beat? Next time you start this cleanup transition in your classroom, try embedding all three of these elements and see if you achieve the goal of increasing the child's compliance with instructions. I feel the need to pause and acknowledge that I know we're simplifying a very complex series of behaviors here. in order to relate them to these categories, right? This is a half-hour webinar. So I want to acknowledge that your real life interactions with children may not look and sound like the one in this example. Approach this activity as an opportunity to learn how to break down a skill into its smaller pieces and then incorporate those pieces into your routine. This time, I'd like us to analyze a scenario. Let's see if we can identify the 3 skill categories. We're looking for movement, language, social emotional skills. I'd like us to focus on the adult's actions. What is the adult doing? And you can see that highlighted in bold font on the slide. So let's look at the scenario. This is about navigating a social dilemma. So in the classroom, Jaden is playing with a car. And as he's racing it around, he bumps into Charlie. And Charlie begins to cry. So after checking on Charlie first, right? We want to make sure the child who got hurt is okay. After we check on Charlie, the adult walks over, points to Charlie, and models the sign for hurt while saying hurt. Look, Charlie is hurt. Jaden looks at Charlie. He imitates the sign for hurt and then gently rubs his arm. Remember, we are looking for the language, movement, and social emotional behavioral component that are embedded in this one strategy. So it's time for a matching chat. Using the scenario that we just outlined on the previous slide, I would like for us to match the adult strategy component, which is in the left column, with the correct skill category in the right column. Type the 3 numbers and corresponding letters into the chat box. So example 7Z, put all 3 of your relationships, put those 3 categories, your 3 answers should have a letter and a number, and we can enter those into the chat box. To make things just a little bit easier, I want to hone in on the action. So if you look on our slide, you'll see that there is a bolded and underlined portion of each of the strategies. That's to give you a little direction there. Nice. I see a couple are coming in now. So if you're still working it through, it's okay. Keep entering those answers. I do want to say that this was a little bit open-ended, and after I revealed what are the correct results, we're going to talk about that a little more, because these categories are way more fluid than any one of us thinks. But for the purposes of this activity, let's get started. So let's look at number 1. The adult points to Charlie and imitates a sad face. And underlined, you see imitates a sad face. Well, this relates to C, a social, emotional, and behavioral skill. I am demonstrating feelings by showing what my face might look like if I'm feeling sad. So here's the example where number 1 goes with C, social, emotional, behavioral. 2, the adult models the sign for hurt. Models meaning I'm demonstrating for the child how to do the sign. So in number 2, the modeling of the sign is a direct relation to a movement, oh no, a movement skill, sorry. So the action of doing the sign is where the learning is coming from. I am demonstrating and teaching with the movement of my fingers. Here's a quick fun fact. Did you know that for most children under the age of 2, they acquire language whether you are saying it to them and they hear it, or whether you encourage them to say the word, or whether you imitate a sign for them? All 3 of those learning inputs still strengthen language. There's not one that does it better than the others. So children learn language as much by watching and you speak and hearing you talk and watching your mouth as if they were actually doing the learning themselves or doing the talking. Hope that didn't confuse you. Hope that made sense. So here we go. Number 3. The adult says, hurt, hurt. Look, Charlie is hurt. Now here, underlined in orange, it says. This is the language component. Here we can see that the adult is using language, in this case, in the form of verbal communication, to convey a thought to Jaden. So I mentioned this at the beginning. We could easily make the case that additional pairings could be drawn between these components and categories. This is just another example of how strengthening one skill has multiple purposes and develops and strengthens other skills at the same time. So if you did have a different pairing, if we had more time, we can go into all of them. You're probably not wrong. For the purposes of this, we just wanted to focus on very specific words. So thanks for entering your answers into the chat box. Now you may be thinking, we don't have time to do all these 3 things with all the kids all the time. I get it. Post-COVID programs may look and feel and sound and smell and do all these things in a different way, right? We're fundamentally changing our routines. So I get that. If we could walk away from this, I'd like for you to think about how you can embed these 3 skill categories into whatever your new individual routines and classroom practices look like. Another thing, we don't have to wait for a social dilemma to arise. These strategies can be used to strengthen skills throughout the day. Let's consider how we might embed these 3 skill categories into your new mealtime routine. So, language. Maybe we can name the different types of food and describe the colors or even the placement on the plate. So I'm putting my potatoes at the top of my plate. The point is, I just want to be talking about what I'm seeing, smelling, and experiencing during this mealtime routine. Movement. Maybe you can model how to hold the utensils or how to hold a cup. Maybe you could demonstrate or imitate for children how they might scrape their food off their plate or scoop onto their plate. Now this one might be a little modified because depending on your new mealtime rituals, maybe demonstrating this for the children is a way of keeping socially distant and not in limiting touch. For social, emotional, and behavioral skills, we want to praise children every time they try something new. Like, wow, I didn't see you use your spoon like that before. You know, kids tend to hold spoons like a shovel, and we want them to hold it more like this, right? I'm not demonstrating it perfectly, but maybe that's something that we want to call out and say, wow, I love how you're trying to control your spoon so much better. So remember, the best recipe for educating babies is to use all 3 of these skill categories. That's it. That's the magic. Support behavior by embedding language, movement, and social, emotional, behavioral skills. The most important thing is to purposefully incorporate these 3 concepts into all of your actions whenever possible. I'd like to leave you with one quick story. I get to help raise my 5-year-old niece. Now, when she was a baby, as many kids do at that age, we went through this hitting and rough play phase. Well, let's be honest, we're still going through it, but it's different now. But when she was a baby, she really liked to smack people on their face when she was playing. So my niece's parents, my spouse, and I all agreed that we're going to address those behaviors the same. In that moment, we would look at her, we would demonstrate the sign for hurt, show a sad face, and say, ouch, ouch, that hurts. Now, we did this a number of times, and we all did it the same way. And you know what? I can almost remember the exact interaction where the light bulb went on. She made the connection. There was this look in her eyes. And so after a few times, I remember her stopping, imitating the sign for hurt, and gently touching my cheek. So the cat's out of the bag. The kid in the scenario, that was my niece. We just changed around the names. This strategy worked for us. And I really believe that it could work for your students too. So we're at that point in the presentation where there are some ways to take your learning just a little bit further. So the first thing you can do is view some of our related webinar topics on our online learning center. Two specific ones that fit into this learning category are in our infant toddler series. One is called Safe Ways to Meet the Need to Climb, which is very focused on developing those movement skills indoors. The other one is Activities that Support Social Emotional Development. So these are two other strategies and categories these are two other webinar topics that extend learning in this category. There will also be another webinar that is focused on language and processing skills coming up next month. You might want to check out this related tip sheet, which is Supporting Toddler Emotional Development. Now, this is a summary of one of our most popular 2-hour live training topics, but it just gets down into the nitty-gritty of why are children's emotions and behaviors so intricately tied together, and what can we do to support that development? You might want to branch out and check out a web series that is specific to infant and toddler brain development. And it's provided through iLabs, which is the Institute for Learning and Brain Sciences. These are 20-minute short video presentations. They're all free and can be accessed through the link below. If you're like me and you'd like to know what the science is driving, what science is driving this information, here's a list of our references. Again, you can look at them at your leisure through the printable handout that you'll receive. And then we're at our question and answer section. So I'm going to take a quick second and allow anybody who does share any questions, concerns, comments that you may have into the chat box.
Thank you so much, Philip. While we're waiting for those questions to come in, I will go ahead and share some wrap-up information with everyone. Again, as Philip said, if you have questions, you can type them into the chat box. But if you're watching the recording in our online learning center, you can submit questions to support@kit.org, and we will follow up with the response as soon as possible. And we also want to make sure you're aware that within our online learning center, you can also take a survey at the end of this presentation. And so we encourage you to do so, to give us your feedback and let us know what you would like to see us do in the future. And also you are able to take a quiz to be able to earn CEUs. Just know that before you can take the quiz, you have to complete the survey. And we hope that you will join us next time when we continue this series. And this time it will be on language and processing in the toddler years.
So Amanda, we had a question that came up before we continue. Maybe I can just take a minute and answer it. So one of the questions that came in was about using recorded music. So the question was, is recorded music a bad thing? And I want to kind of expand on that. No, I did not mean to insinuate that using recorded music is a bad thing. It's not a bad idea. What I wanted to clarify is, in the study where we showed that toddlers were more cooperative, the study specifically made reference to the adults singing and actively participating along with the child. So to speak on this idea that music or recorded music is helpful, it can be. If you play the cleanup song, then sing the song, clap out the syllables, move your body along with the music, because the magic or the strategy was based on adult interaction with the child and not just requiring children to listen to the song being played on a radio. Another question came in, well, can children who aren't walking begin to learn language? And from every study that I read, every brain scientist says yes, that movement and exploration could be babies who are just learning to support their neck, right? That movement allows me to see so much more of my environment, which encourages my brain to want to explore. So keeping in mind that ambulation, I mentioned that word before, right? The action of moving my body was what they focused on very specifically in that study, but so much more of the scientific research says any kind of movement will encourage language. So we had a comment saying, yeah, my daughter started walking around 15 months, but she was an early communicator. And I think that's a really great example of, I don't want to get caught on, oh, this kid's not walking yet, they can't learn language. No, any type of movement will be helpful for children. Actually, the part of the child's brain, but under the age of 2, that is responsible for this movement sits right next to the part of their brain that is responsible for new word acquisition. So everything that I read in research says when you want to teach language, combine it with some sort of movement activity, which is why sign language or anything that I'm doing that blends movement with communication is so important. So thank you for your comments and your questions. Please, if there are any others, don't hesitate, enter them into the chat box.
Thank you again, Philip. Thank you so much. And while we're giving just an extra minute here to see if any more questions do come in, we want to also encourage all of you to continue to tap into the resources that KIT has available for you. So here is some information about our Online Learning Center, as well as our Inclusion Support Center. And then there's the contact information for our various Inclusion Support Center desk lines. And of course, we'd always love to stay connected with you in the social media world. So here is the information where you can connect with us on Facebook, Twitter, Pinterest, and all the other great platforms that are out there. So I'm double checking here. I don't see anything coming in through the chat box or through the Q&A. So I think we are safe to wrap up for the day. Again, we appreciate all of you spending some time with us and working through the technical difficulties at the beginning to continue to participate in today's lesson. And we hope that you're taking away some great tips and tools to bring back to your programs. But please remember that KIT is always here for you as a resource and a partner. So let us know how we can assist you in any way. Thank you again, Philip, for taking the charge. And thank you all for joining us. And we hope you have a very great day.
Thanks, everyone.